Our second speaker is Professor Michèle Lamont, and she will be speaking on responses to discrimination and the transformation of group boundaries in Brazil, Israel, and the United States. Professor Lamont is is the Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies and Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Harvard. So that indicates your range. It's extremely impressive. An eminent cultural sociologist, her work focuses on how ideas of worth sustain hierarchies and social inequality, and her publications are many, and most recently, The Dignity of Working Men, Morality and the Boundaries of Race, Class and Immigration. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. Like Miguel, my mother would be very happy that I'm here, if she could know that I'm here. But and I'm also pleased to speak in the Hong Kong Theatre. I'm Canadian, so I feel like among people with whom I share same Queen, and this Hong Kong Theatre reminds me of this collective identity. So this is really a low-tech part of the show compared to Miguel. I'm going to talk to you about a very large research project that started in 2006, which is being conducted with colleagues at Tel Aviv University and at Federal University in Rio. I'm working closely with two former Harvard graduate students, Crystal Fleming and Jessica Welber, who are now teaching at Stony Brook and Michigan, respectively. So the book that was mentioned earlier, Dignity of Working Man, was a sequel to another book published in 1992 titled Money, Morals and Manners, The Culture of the French and the American Upper Middle Class. Both books were based on in-depth interviews with upper middle class people in one case, working class people in the other. And the book's goal was to try to understand how the individuals I was interviewing define the worth of people. What are the criteria by which someone who's considered worthy might be identified? And the blurring of moral criteria for drawing racial and class boundaries. The first book was a critique of Bourdieu's distinction. The conclusion was, when we think about worth, we often think about moral worth. And in Bourdieu's work, that was extremely marginal. And the dignity of working man, again, morality, being a responsible worker who shows up, who pays his bill, who keeps his kids out of trouble, was very central in how workers would define their self-worth. And then he uses moral criteria to also create racial and class boundaries against immigrants and the middle class. So this cycle, 12-year cycle of book production was very much organized around studying exclusion, the process of group construction of symbolic communities in terms of what we are and what we are not. And I wrote papers such as this paper in Annual Review of Sociology, titled The Study of Boundaries Across the Social Sciences, that aimed at parsing out, in part, the relationship between social boundaries and symbolic boundaries, and set up an agenda to discuss the property and the mechanisms of boundary work. And then in 2003, I was invited with political scientist Peter Hall to co-chair a research project titled Successful Societies, where we were asked to do whatever we wanted, as long as the title Successful Societies was there. So we were all very reluctant to use the words. It seemed very weird to talk about successful societies. We agreed to look at the least ethnocentric dimension of societal success, low infant mortality, high life expectancy, and I decided to specialize in social inclusion, the undoing of group boundaries, by looking at the kind of boundary work that was produced by ordinary people, and more specifically by members of stigmatized groups. So I'm French-Canadian. I grew up in Quebec, in the middle of, at the height of the nationalist movement. I even grew up at the physical border between English and French Canada, next to Ottawa. There's a river. that separates the Francophone and the Anglophone world, with 80% of French speakers on one side and 80% of English speakers on the other side. So these questions, I would say, were almost second nature to me. And during my youth, I saw the collective identity of Québécois to be totally revolutionized. You know, before I was born, the words white nigger of America were used to describe French Canadians. And during the 60s and 70s, there was an explosion of cultural expressiveness, or work for collectively redefining the meaning of what the Québécois were about, which in many ways paralleled what happened in the US with African Americans. So I was very interested, also as a Québécois who I did my graduate work in France, and then I went to the US and did my whole professional trajectory there, about the range of responses that one can find in, when you face moments of stigmatization. You can think of Albert Hirschman, voice, exit and loyalty. There's a very wide repertoire that had never really been studied. So together with those colleagues, we decided to choose cases where, a priori, we could expect the porousness of the group boundaries to vary enormously across cases. So we chose Brazil because it's a context in which sociability across racial group is very high, although, of course, discrimination and class inequality is enormous. We chose Israel for the obvious reasons that this is a place where ethnic and religious boundaries are being policed extremely vigorously, and we chose the US because we didn't know exactly how it would compare. And we went around, we created a research design that is parallel for the three places, 150 interviews in each basis, half middle class, half working class, male, female. And the first result from this big project that just came out in the last issue of Ethnic and Racial Studies that you can find on the website of the journal, and you can access the introduction for free, I am told. So the theoretical move that I'm doing in the paper I'm talking to you today is really about the role of cultural repertoires. What are the bundle of ideas that are available out there in the environment in which people live, on which they can draw to develop these responses to stigmatization. So to give you a very broad overview of the conclusions that were reached in this special issue of Ethnic and Racial Studies, we argued that the most frequently encountered response that we got in the US when we asked our respondents what is the best way. There's many, many probes that we use in the project to identify their responses. This paper is based on what are the best responses for dealing with racism. The most frequently encountered one is confront. You have no choice, you have to fight. And we argue that this response is partially popular, in part because since the civil rights movement, there's a very wide acknowledgement about the racist history of the US, and that this is simply inappropriate, that African Americans, it's a country where we have this notion of opportunity, and therefore it is legitimate for people to respond this way. My colleagues in Brazil argued that the predominant response there is to remind the racists about the racial mixture of the society they live in. They talk about racial mixture in all kinds of ways. So to caricature, one could say, who's your grandmother? We're all a little bit black. So who do you think you are for engaging in this kind of discrimination? And in Israel, we have three stigmatized groups, which are Ethiopian Jews, Mizrahi, Oriental Jews, and Arab Israelis. And my co-authors there, Mr. Mizrahi and Hannah Herzog, argue that the predominant response among Ethiopian Jews and Mizrahi is participatory destigmatization, which means, yes, we're discriminated right now, but we are Jews, and as Jews, we are part of the symbolic community, and with times like Russian Jews, we will become part of the great Zionist nation. So in the case of Arab Jews, of course, is slightly different. We use universal repertoires having to do with human rights and human dignity. But the dominant pattern in the three countries we argue is very much symbiotic with, it's fed by the national myths that prevail in the three societies, you know. This notion of equality of opportunity, the American dream in the US, racial democracy in Brazil, and the Zionist dream in Israel. But that's not what the paper is about. Today what I want to do is really to talk to you about other repertoires that are widely available. And this is really a complement to the enormous social psychological literature on in-group and out-group. You know, they're not looking at the societal context that feeds the responses to stigma. And that's one of the contributions that cultural sociology can make. This is in the context of the Successful Society Project. We just finished a second book which will come out at with Cambridge University Press titled Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Age. And what this book does is, you know, where social resilience means this is not about individuals who are resilient. It's about the social conditions, the kind of scaffolding, cultural and institutional scaffolding that are available to individuals to be able to prosper, and to communities. It's not necessarily about individuals, under market fundamentalism, the privatization of the self, and all the other conditions that make people much more vulnerable under neoliberalism. So really the paper I'm presenting to you is a chapter in that book that spells out the cultural conditions. So what we want to do in this thing is very much to provide a multidimensional analysis of the tools that are there to strengthen social, and this includes, you know, the kind of policies that countries adopt that provide wider tools for recognition. It's really about the politics of recognition. So Michael Banting's Multicultural Policy Index, which was recently shown in a wonderful paper by Irene Blumrad in Politics, Perspective on Politics, he shows that emotional and cognitive commitment by minority members to their whole society is much greater in societies where all these multicultural policies that are part of the multicultural index are promoted. Basically, sociology of the conditions that sustain greater recognition as a dimension of successful societies. So think about this in relation to Amartya Sen, or to the Human Development Index, or to a lot of the work that is being done that measures societal success in economic terms. Here I'm thinking about belonging, the capacity to imagine, you know, possible selves as groups that are empowering and affirming. That's what I'm interested in. So I'm going to start with two vignettes to give you a little bit of concrete understanding of what I mean when I'm talking about responses to stigmatization. In both cases, we have African American men. When they talk in our interviews about, you know, our question, can you give me an example of context where you felt stigmatized or discriminated against? They use words like feeling underestimated, distrusted, over-scrutinized, misunderstood, feared, overlooked, avoided, plainly discriminated against. So we find a very complex lexicon. It's a little bit like, you know, Inuits are talking about snow. It's far more complex than it has been acknowledged so far in the literature. That's one of the things that interest us. But here I'm giving you two strikingly similar narratives about an African-American man who finds himself in an elevator with non-blacks. So in the first case, Marcus, a black court employee, enters an elevator in which he finds a middle-aged Indian woman who also works at the court. So he describes the situation thus. He says, "She clutches her purse. I almost fainted. It devastated me, but it's happened to brothers before. Welcome to the black race, brother. You've got it, I've got it." Her reaction prompts Marcus's anger and humiliation because, as he explained, he often feels that people think he does not belong in the court building. For instance, he's routinely questioned about whether he truly works there and whether he knows the name of people who work there. That's part of his everyday experience. How should he respond? Ignore the slight and let go? Confront? How? And at what cost? Emotionally, interactionally, potentially legally? So he wants to maintain his image of professionalism and stand up for himself. But how can he do both? These are the questions that emerge when he experiences stigmatization as an ongoing part of his daily life. The repeated experience of such an internal dialogue takes a toll and contributes to the wear and tear of everyday life that results in the huge racial discrepancy in health in the US and elsewhere. The second example is partly gripping. Joe, a recreation specialist, faces a more explicit racist situation. So his account viscerally expresses his perception of the health impact of anger in the experience of stigmatization. So he finds himself alone in an elevator with some white men, and he describes the scene this way. He says, one of them made a joke about blacks and monkeys. I said, man, listen, I ain't into jokes. His demeanor changed, my demeanor changed. All of the positive energy that was in there was being sucked out because of the racial part. And the other guys, you could actually see them shrinking up in the corner because they didn't want no part in it. I told myself, get out of it, because if I stay in here, I'm going to be in that circle and I won't be able to get out of it. The stress level rose, my tolerance was getting thin, my blood pressure peaking and my temper rising. By the grace of God, thank you, Jesus, as I stepped off the elevator, there was a black minister walking past. I said, can I speak to you for a minute because I just encountered something that I got to talk about because I'm this far from exploding. I've been at the job for only a week. This is all I need to get myself fired. The guy said, you're a better man than me. Now I'm just trying to get through this whole affair to decide if I want to go to the city to sue the bastard. So his anger and impulse control is imperative if he wants to keep his job. He has to manage his emotion. He has to manage his emotion and find an outlet. When a chance encounter with this African American pastor offers relief or a buffer, someone he can relate to, someone who understands what he's going through. So like the majority of our interviewees, he factors in pragmatic consideration when weighing various courses of action. He doesn't want to lose his job. But his normative response is that he needs to confront. Why? So then I have a section which I'm going to skip, explaining why it is that this response of confrontation is so important. I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes that shows you what these responses look like. At this point in the project, this is a project that started in 2006. So all the data is collected, everything is coded using Atlas AI. We have an enormous sheet that describes more than 1,000 incidents, such as this one, that was related to us, and the context in which it happened, and the responses. But I'm not at the point where I can present this to you. I'll simply give you a few illustrations. So what does confront mean? An example is given to us by a prison instructor. When asked how we should deal with racism, he responds, you have to confront it, because people will try to tell you that it doesn't exist, and it does exist. Confront it, not in a negative way, but just bring it up, discuss it. While folks will try to tell you that it doesn't exist, and they'll try to reverse it on you. So the shared belief in the importance of confronting is, we argue, embedded in the widely spread availability of the national narratives about the racist history of the U.S., to which they often make reference in the context of the interviews. Many of them talked about the experience of their parents growing up in the South, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, etc., the civil rights movements in which many of them have participated. So the salience of these events in the collective memory legitimizes for them the importance of responding. And most of them have very strong, or at least the question that their racial boundary is salient to them goes without saying. They might prefer to be described as African Americans or as blacks or as Afro-American. The label varies, but in all cases, the fact that they're black is the first thing they mention when you ask them what kind of person are you, which is not the case when it comes to Brazil. It's much more up for grabs. So one of the puzzles of the study is how the kinds of responses that you obtain varies with the degree of consolidation of racial boundaries. If you're not sure that you've experienced discrimination, if you think you might be discriminated against because you're you're working class instead, the nature of the response will be much different. So now I want to turn to, let's presume that I've had a time to describe to you in great detail how the national myths of the United States sustain these response about the legitimacy of confronting, because we all, Americans, ideology, nationalism is grounded in this notion of opportunity, of equality of opportunity, which has been acknowledged as not being there for African Americans, therefore they've been empowered to confront. I now want to talk about two other sources of cultural repertoires besides these national myths that feed directly into their responses, and these are neoliberalism and the collective identity of African Americans as moral and resilient people, which feeds a notion of cultural intimacy and criteria of worth that act as an alternative measuring stick, which allows them to feel strong people despite the fact that many of them are lower on the socioeconomic scale. How am I doing?
Let's see. I think you've got another 20 minutes just about.
So let's slow down. Okay. So let's look at how neoliberalism feeds into the responses. So those are responses that emphasize self-reliance and autonomy, which are connected to, for instance, individualization and the privatization of risk, which go hand in hand with neoliberalism. Competitiveness in educational and economic achievement, and third, the ability to signal status through consumption. So here the idea is, I'm going to prove to you that I'm equal, that I don't deserve being stigmatized, because I'm as competitive as you are. I'm as able to consume as you are. So when I did the Decade of Working Man, I had started exploring this topic, and I was very surprised when African American workers would tell me, well, if I can buy a house and you can buy a house, we're equal. Basically, the ability to stand as a criteria of equality. There was no equivalent to this in France. In the French context, money was never a criteria of equality. It was always a criteria of inequality. So this is the kind of idea that I had at the back of my mind before we put the project together. So, talking about the place of these three kinds of arguments in responses to stigmatization can be complicated because, of course, some of these elements are also part of the American dream, which are, elements of cultural repertoires that precede neoliberalism. The argument we make is that they are made even more salient by the advent of neoliberalism. At the time, this started in 1980 when I teach. This week we met our prospective graduate students who are, between 22 and 30. They are the children of neoliberalism. They don't know anything else but that. They have learned, their self has been formatted by neoliberalism for the last 30 years. So they've learned to be extremely competitive and to mold themselves in such a way that they survive the hyper-competitiveness in which they function. And this is also the kind of environment that the African American youth is facing. So the question of coming to be able to define oneself as hyper-competitive becomes a tool for destigmatization, especially when you're an African American in a context where the racial stereotypes tell you that you're an underachiever. So what we find in our responses is that emphasizing the ability of African Americans to compete is extremely salient. Wanting to become an entrepreneur, wanting to demonstrate self-reliance and autonomy, which are also responses to these stereotypes. So with neoliberalism comes also the privatization of risk. So the question of the extent to which their strategies for responses are individualist strategies or collective strategies is also a major stake. So often education is mentioned as a legitimate strategy, but is it education as a mean to become a successful professional, which will give you money to buy a Rolex and you can then flash in moments of where you feel, or wear your Brooks Brothers outfit so that you deter or you prevent discrimination, or is it that you think that education is a collective tool for self-empowerment? This is very complicated, and we need to basically recode everything to be able to judge how each mention of education are tapping individualist and collective strategies. So while there's great variation in how African Americans interpret this American dream, many of them define it as a nightmare, the majority of our respondents say that African Americans should work to get ahead and get educated, and that they should persevere regardless of persistent discrimination. One of the papers that just came out in the ERS issue provides evidence for that by Wilbur and Whitman. So their desire to make it big is all over the interviews. Many of them are dreaming of starting their own business, the idea that if you have your own business, you have the autonomy, you don't have to put up with the daily experience of racism. They put a very high value on hard work and its most important income, financial independence. So one working class man is partly vocal advocate of economic achievement. He describes the people he likes as hustlers who hold several jobs and are willing to do anything to make money. I quote, for instance, Jared, he does landscaping in the morning for a company, then he has his own contracts in the middle of the day, sleeps and goes to work for FedEx at night. I like to see hustlers because that's something that I do, just hustling. No laws are being broke. No one is being hurt. He thinks it's wonderful that this guy has 3 jobs, as opposed to reading this as that's what neoliberalism does to people. You have to take 3 jobs to be able to make a living. A great emphasis is also put on self-reliance in contrast to the racist stereotype of low-income American as lazy people who depend on others for subsistence and don't want to pull their own weight. So one woman who works for a dry cleaning business in a grocery store who defines herself as a have-noter states, I don't like beggars. I don't like anybody looking for a handout. I like people that want to get out and do something for themselves and help themselves. I don't like beggars. So the blaming of the poor for their lack of responsibility and self-reliance is very salient in both the working class and the middle class narratives. And in the middle class in particular, there's an enormous emphasis put on the ability to do the job. One of them says, we love to compete, anything that you put us in that's athletic, we just excel, we love to compete. So a redefinition of what African Americans are about in terms of the virtues that are promoted by neoliberalism. And this is very much in line with the kind of work that Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thibault, for instance, have done, Boltanski and Ketel have developed in their book, The New Spirit of Capitalism. The notion that you have a self-concept that is entrepreneurial, that comes together with the development of neoliberalism. I'm going to skip the quotes on education. Essentially, they say, as African Americans, we're extremely vulnerable. If you decide to invest in sport, you can always lose your spot, but your diploma, you need it. Thanks to your diploma, you'll be able to compete on the job market. The competition has the diploma, you need the diploma to be able to make your way. And as I said earlier, lots of variation in the extent to which the education is used for personal mobility or for group empowerment. Consumption is very much viewed as a means for gaining cultural citizenship, the idea that you have to dress well all the time to be able to demonstrate that you belong. And the interviews are full of references to the need to be able to have, things in order to respond to racism. Okay. The third cultural repertoire that they draw on is one that is largely self-generated in the sense that it is a repertoire that African Americans develop about the collective identity, their collective identity, which serves as a buffer for many of them. And this is accomplished through a shared sense of we-ness that can act as a source of support and comfort. Second, an identity defined in opposition to that of whites that reinforces an alternative matrix of moral worth, which is in tension with neoliberalism, which is about socioeconomic worth as a basis for integration. And third, an awareness of a shared tradition of resilience. So in the context of the interview, many respondents talk about what is the common culture of African Americans, what are their shared experiences. So they talk at length about the cultural experience of intimacy, which means that they're able to relate to each other and understand when they communicate with each other what is the shared experience. If you think about, the guy coming out of the elevator and seeing an African American minister, knowing this person knows what I just went through, simply because we're both African Americans. So one middle-aged interviewee described to us what it means for him, this cultural intimacy. He says, "That's what I like about our people. Good or bad, we're coming together. We all got an uncle somewhere that chases young girls, and the grandmother somewhere that has certain sayings, or an aunt who cooks a sweet potato pie. You put us together in a restaurant and we'll walk out of there laughing because it's going to be something that we all have in common. And that's just our people. That's just the way it is. I haven't met anybody that didn't have a grandmother like my grandmother or an aunt or somebody." So this experience of cultural similarity and intimacy is a source of resilience. Another interviewee describes blacks as having, quote, having a bond, as being on the same frequency. Others explain that African Americans have no problem reading one another or feelings where others are coming from. This shared sense of shared background or cultural intimacy is also salient in discussion of interracial relationship, where the absence of a shared culture is viewed as a major challenge. One of them, for instance, described why he doesn't want to have white romantic partners. He says, "She can't get the joy out of watching Mandela get out of jail. She can't understand when 3 white police officers shoot 2 black men for nothing. She could say they should not have been there. You see, I would have to show her." So when probing interviewees about what are the distinct characteristics, we find that this notion of shared culture is very frequently mentioned, as well as other notions such as, cultural similar morality, the importance of religion, the fact that African Americans are caring people, the richness of black culture, black aesthetics, and popular culture. Each of these responses represent 11% of the 307 responses that we got on this probe. So it is this notion of a shared African American culture is very strong. The notion of resilience is also very strong. So we can see here those data really provide support to the notion of a shared identity. Of course, social psychologists have written a lot on this notion of African American shared identity, but they do not connect it to these the cultural structures that act as sources for recognition, like I'm discussing here. We also argue that because they define their identity as blacks partly in opposition to that of white, I argued in my book, The Being of Working Man, that when asked to define their self-worth, they define African American worth largely as caring self, and they tend to some extent to oppose this to a white identity of disciplined self. And they will say that African American have been caring and accepting, have the spirit, have souls, and are more in contact with the human things than whites. And some of the descriptions of white pointed to them as materialist, power-obsessed, arrogant, and self-serving. So in this context, I developed the argument that the self-concept of African Americans as more moral than whites means that is available to them an alternative matrix of evaluation that counterbalances the emphasis on personal achievement that is sustained by individualism. And that this matrix functions as an alternative measuring stick that sustains a somewhat autonomous social space where they can cultivate a sense of dignity and self-pride, despite their low socioeconomic status. So, in other words, they don't have to define themselves as losers if they find other criteria of evaluation that are slightly autonomous from socioeconomic success. And there's this notion that by being much more self-affirmative about the tradition, the African American tradition, that it is a way to strengthen the pride of their children in the group values. And that's very much in line with other studies that we're aware of. For instance, one project that compared a number of tribes in British Columbia that varied in terms of number of suicide rate, and it was shown that the tribes where shared identity and a notion of the shared past, of cultivation of collective identity, acted as a buffer and made the youth in those groups much more resilient. So I think I'm now going to turn to conclusion simply to discuss a little bit, what is the takeaway line here in terms of the conditions that might foster greater social resilience. Essentially a strong affirmation and a strong grounding in a collective identity that gives people a sense of possible selves, of what the group can do collectively in the future as they project themselves. And this is very much in line again with the social psychological literature that shows, for instance, that low-income children who do best in school, for instance, are those who have a strong sense of group pride, but who are also connected with the mainstream culture, that is, who are bilingual, who are able to do both. I have much more about future research, but I think I'll stop here, and I look forward to your questions.